Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8, Part 1. My holidays, especially one happy afternoon. When we arrived before day at the inn where the mail stopped, which was not the inn where my friend the waiter lived, I was shown up to a nice little bedroom with dolphin painted on the door. Very cold I was, I know, notwithstanding the hot tea they'd given me before a large fire downstairs, and very glad I was to turn into the dolphin's bed, pull the dolphin's blankets round my head, and go to sleep. Mr. Barkis, the carrier, was to call for me in the morning at 9 o'clock. I got up at 8, a little giddy from the shortness of my night's rest, and was ready for him before the appointed time. He received me exactly as if not 5 minutes had elapsed since we were last together, and I had only been into the hotel to get change for sixpence or something of that sort. As soon as I and my box were in the cart and the carrier seated, the lazy horse walked away with us all at his accustomed pace. "You look very well, Mr. Barkis," I said, thinking he would like to know it. Mr. Barkis rubbed his cheek with his cuff and then looked at his cuff as if he expected to find some of the bloom upon it, but made no other acknowledgment of the compliment. "I gave your message, Mr. Barkis," I said. "I wrote to Peggotty." "Ah," said Mr. Barkis. Mr. Barkis seemed gruff and answered dryly. "Wasn't it right, Mr. Barkis?" I asked after a little hesitation. "Why, no," said Mr. Barkis. "Not the message?" "The message was right enough, perhaps," said Mr. Barkis, "but it come to an end there." Not understanding what he meant, I repeated inquisitively, "Came to an end, Mr. Barkis?" "Nothing come of it," he explained, looking at me sideways. "No answer." "There was an answer expected, was there, Mr. Barkis?" said I, opening my eyes, for this was a new light to me. "When a man says he's willing," said Mr. Barkis, turning his glance slowly on me again, "it's as much as to say that man's a-waiting for an answer." "Well, Mr. Barkis?" "Well," said Mr. Barkis, carrying his eyes back to his horse's ears, "that man's been a-waiting for a answer ever since." "Have you told her so, Mr. Barkis?" No, growled Mr. Barkis, reflecting about it. "I ain't got no call to go and tell her so. I never said 6 words to her myself. I ain't a-going to tell her so." "Would you like me to do it, Mr. Barkis?" said I, doubtfully. "You might tell her if you would," said Mr. Barkis, with another slow look at me, "that Barkis was a-waiting for a answer. Says you—" "What name is it?" "Her name?" "Ah," said Mr. Barkis, with a nod of his head. "Peggotty." "Christian name, or natural name," said Mr. Barkis. "Oh, it's not her Christian name. Her Christian name is Clara." "Is it, though?" said Mr. Barkis. He seemed to find an immense fund of reflection in this circumstance, and sat pondering and inwardly whistling for some time. "Well," he resumed at length, "says you, Peggotty, Barkis is waiting for a answer. Says she, perhaps answer to what? Says you, to what I told you. What is that? Says she. Barkis is willing. Says you." This extremely artful suggestion Mr. Barkis accompanied with a nudge of his elbow that gave me quite a stitch in my side. After that, he slouched over his horse in his usual manner and made no other reference to the subject, except half an hour afterwards taking a piece of chalk from his pocket and writing up inside the tilt of the cart, "Clara Peggotty," apparently as a private memorandum. Ah, what a strange feeling it was to be going home when it was not home, and to find that every object I looked at reminded me of the happy old home, which was like a dream I could never dream again. The days when my mother and I and Peggotty were all in all to one another, and there was no one to come between us, rose up before me so sorrowfully on the road that I am not sure I was glad to be there. Not sure, but that I would rather have remained away and forgotten it in Steerforth's company. But there I was, and soon I was at our house, where the bare old elm trees wrung their many hands in the bleak wintry air, and shreds of the old rooks' nests drifted away upon the wind. The carrier put my box down at the garden gate and left me. I walked along the path towards the house, glancing at the windows, and fearing at every step to see Mr. Murdstone or Miss Murdstone lowering out of one of them. No face appeared, however, and being come to the house and knowing how to open the door before dark without knocking, I went in with a quiet, timid step. God knows how infantine the memory may have been that was awakened within me by the sound of my mother's voice in the old parlour when I set foot in the hall. She was singing in a low tone. I think I must have lain in her arms and heard her singing so to me when I was but a baby. The strain was new to me, and yet it was so old that it filled my heart brimful, like a friend come back from a long absence. I believed, from the solitary and thoughtful way in which my mother murmured her song, that she was alone, and I went softly into the room. She was sitting by the fire, suckling an infant, whose tiny hand she held against her neck. Her eyes were looking down upon its face, and she sat singing to it. I was so far right that she had no other companion. I spoke to her, and she started and cried out, but seeing me, she called me her dear Davy, her own boy, and coming half across the room to meet me, kneeled down upon the ground and kissed me, and laid my head down on her bosom near the little creature that was nestling there, and put its hands to my lips. I wish I had died. I wish I had died then, with that feeling in my heart. I should have been more fit for heaven than I have ever been since. "He is your brother," said my mother, fondling me. "Davy, my pretty boy, my poor child." Then she kissed me more and more and clasped me round the neck. This she was doing when Peggotty came running in and bounced down on the ground beside us and went mad about us both for a quarter of an hour. It seemed that I had not been expected so soon, the carrier being much before his usual time. It seemed, too, that Mr. and Miss Murdstone had gone out upon a visit in the neighbourhood, and would not return before night. I had never hoped for this. I had never thought it possible that we three could be together undisturbed once more, and I felt for the time as if the old days were come back. We dined together by the fireside. Peggotty was in attendance to wait upon us, but my mother wouldn't let her do it, and made her dine with us. I had my own old plate with a brown view of a man of war in full sail upon it, which Peggotty had hoarded somewhere all the time I'd been away, and would not have had broken, she said, for £100. I had my old mug with David on it, and my own old little knife and fork that wouldn't cut. While we were at table, I thought it a favourable occasion to tell Peggotty about Mr. Barkis, who, before I had finished what I had to tell her, began to laugh and throw her apron over her face. "Peggotty," said my mother, "what's the matter?" Peggotty only laughed the more and held her apron tight over her face when my mother tried to pull it away, and sat as if her head were in a bag. "What are you doing, you stupid creature?" said my mother, laughing. "Oh, drat the man," said Peggotty. He wants to marry me." "It would be a very good match for you, wouldn't it?" said my mother.
"Oh, I don't know," said Peggotty. "Don't ask me. I wouldn't have him if he were made of gold, nor I wouldn't have anybody."
"Then why don't you tell him so, you ridiculous thing?" said my mother.
"Tell him so?" retorted Peggotty, looking out of her apron. "He has never said a word to me about it. He knows better. If he was to make so bold as say a word to me, I would slap his face."
Her own was as red as ever I saw it, or any other face, I think, but she only covered it again for a few moments at a time when she was taken with a violent fit of laughter, and after 2 or 3 of those attacks, went on with her dinner. I remarked that my mother, though she smiled when Peggotty looked at her, became more serious and thoughtful. I had seen at first that she was changed. Her face was very pretty still, but it looked careworn and too delicate, and her hand was so thin and white that it seemed to me to be almost transparent. But the change to which I now refer was superadded to this. It was in her manner, which became anxious and fluttered. At last she said, putting out her hand and laying it affectionately on the hand of her old servant, "Peggotty, dear, you are not going to be married?"
"Me, ma'am?" returned Peggotty, staring. "Lord bless you, no."
"Not just yet?" said my mother tenderly.
"Never!"
cried Peggotty. My mother took her hand and said, "Don't leave me, Peggotty. Stay with me. It will not be for long, perhaps. What should I ever do without you?"
"Me? Leave you, my precious?" cried Peggotty. "Not for all the world and his wife. Why, what's put that in your silly little head?"
For Peggotty had been used of old to talk to my mother, sometimes like a child. But my mother made no answer except to thank her, and Peggotty went running on in her own fashion.
"Me leave you? I think I see myself. Peggotty go away from you. I should like to catch her at it." "No, no, no," said Peggotty, shaking her head and folding her arms. "Not she, my dear. It isn't that there ain't some cats that would be well enough pleased if she did, but they shan't be pleased. They shall be aggravated. I'll stay with you till I'm a cross-cranky old woman, and when I'm too deaf and too lame and too blind and too mumbly for want of teeth to be of any use at all, even to be found fault with, then I shall go to my Davy and ask him to take me in."
"And Peggotty," says I shall be glad to see you, and I'll make you as welcome as a queen."
"Bless your dear heart," cried Peggotty. "I know you will." And she kissed me beforehand in grateful acknowledgment of my hospitality. After that, she covered her head up with her apron again and had another laugh about Mr. Barkis. After that, she took the baby out of its little cradle and nursed it. After that, she cleared the dinner table. After that, came in with another cap on and her workbox and the yard measure and the bit of wax candle, all just the same as ever. We sat round the fire and talked delightfully. I told them what a hard master Mr. Creakle was, and they pitied me very much. I told them what a fine fellow Steerforth was, and what a patron of mine, and Peggotty said she would walk a score of miles to see him. I took the little baby in my arms when it was awake and nursed it lovingly. When it was asleep again, I crept close to my mother's side, according to my old custom, broken now a long time, and sat with my arms embracing her waist and my little red cheek on her shoulder, and once more felt her beautiful hair drooping over me like an angel's wing, as I used to think, I recollect, and was very happy indeed. While I sat thus, looking at the fire and seeing pictures in the red-hot coals, I almost believed that I had never been away, that Mr. and Miss Murdstone were such pictures and would vanish when the fire got low, and that there was nothing real in all that I remembered save my mother, Peggotty, and I. Peggotty darned away at a stocking as long as she could see, and then sat with it drawn on her left hand like a glove, and her needle in her right, ready to take another stitch whenever there was a blaze. I cannot conceive whose stockings they can have been that Peggotty was always darning, or where such an unfailing supply of stockings in want of darning can have come from. From my earliest infancy, she seems to have been always employed in that class of needlework, and never, by any chance, in any other. "I wonder," said Peggotty, who was sometimes seized with a fit of wondering on some most unexpected topic, "what's become of Davy's great aunt?"
"Lord, Peggotty," observed my mother, rousing herself from a reverie, "what nonsense you talk!"
"Well, but I really do wonder, ma'am," said Peggotty.
"What can have put such a person in your head?" inquired my mother. "Is there nobody else in the world to come there?"
"I don't know how it is," said Peggotty, "unless it's on account of being stupid. But my head never can pick and choose its people. They come and they go, and they don't come and they don't go, just as they like. I wonder what's become of her."
"How absurd you are, Peggotty," returned my mother. "One would suppose you wanted a second visit from her."
"Lord forbid!" cried Peggotty.
"Well, then don't talk such things about such uncomfortable things. There's a good soul," said my mother. "Miss Betsy is shut up in her cottage by the sea, no doubt, and will remain there. At all events, she is not likely ever to trouble us again."
"No," mused Peggotty. "No, that ain't likely at all.
I wonder if she was to die, whether she'd leave Davy anything." "Good gracious me, Peggotty," returned my mother, "what a nonsensical woman you are, when you know that she took offence at the poor dear boy's ever being born at all."
"I suppose she wouldn't be inclined to forgive him now," hinted Peggotty.
"Why should she be inclined to forgive him now?" said my mother, rather sharply.
"Now that he's got a brother, I mean," said Peggotty.
My mother immediately began to cry and wondered how Peggotty dared to say such a thing. "As if this poor little innocent in its cradle had ever done any harm to you or anybody else, you jealous thing," said she. "You had much better go and marry Mr. Barkis the carrier. Why don't you?"
"I should make Miss Murdstone happy if I was to," said Peggotty.
"What a bad disposition you have, Peggotty," returned my mother. "You are as jealous of Miss Murdstone as it is possible for a ridiculous creature to be. You want to keep the keys yourself and give out all the things, I suppose. I shouldn't be surprised if you did, when you know that she only does it out of kindness and the best intentions. You know she does, Peggotty. You know it well." Peggotty muttered something to the effect of
"Bother the best intentions,"
and something else to the effect that there was a little too much of the best intentions going on. "I know what you mean, you cross thing," said my mother. "I understand you, Peggotty, perfectly. You know I do. And I wonder you don't colour up like fire. But one point at a time. Miss Murdstone is the point now, Peggotty, and you shan't escape from it. Haven't you heard her say over and over again that she thinks I am too thoughtless and too
"Pretty?" suggested Peggotty.
"Well," returned my mother, half laughing, "and if she is so silly as to say so, can I be blamed for it?"
"No one says you can," said Peggotty.
"No, I should hope not, indeed," returned my mother. "Haven't you heard her say over and over again that on this account she wished to spare me a great deal of trouble, which she thinks I am not suited for, and which I really don't know myself that I am suited for? And isn't she up early and late and going to and fro continually, and doesn't she do all sorts of things and grope into all sorts of places, coal holes and pantries and I don't know where, that can't be very agreeable? And do you mean to insinuate that there is not a sort of devotion in that?"
"I don't insinuate at all," said Peggotty.
"You do, Peggotty," returned my mother. "You never do anything else, except your work. You are always insinuating. You revel in it. And when you talk of Mr. Murdstone's good intentions—"
"I never talked of 'em," said Peggotty.
"No, Peggotty," returned my mother, "but you insinuated. That's what I told you just now. That's the worst of you. You will insinuate. I said at the moment that I understood you, and you see I did. When you talk of Mr. Murdstone's good intentions and pretend to slight them, for I don't believe you really do in your heart, Peggotty, you must be as well convinced as I am how good they are, and how they actuate him in everything. If he seems to have been at all stern with a certain person, Peggotty, you understand, and so I am sure does Davy, that I am not alluding to anybody present. It is solely because he is satisfied that it is for a certain person's benefit. He naturally loves a certain person on my account, and acts solely for a certain person's good. He is better able to judge of it than I am, for I very well know that I am a weak, light, girlish creature, and that he is a firm, grave, serious man. And he takes," said my mother, with the tears which were engendered in her affectionate nature stealing down her face, "he takes great pains with me, and I ought to be very thankful to him and very submissive to him, even in my thoughts. And when I'm not, Peggotty, I worry and condemn myself and feel doubtful of my own heart and don't know what to do." Peggotty sat with her chin on the foot of the stocking, looking silently at the fire. "There, Peggotty," said my mother, changing her tone. "Don't let us fall out with one another, for I couldn't bear it. You are my true friend, I know, if I have any in the world. When I call you a ridiculous creature or a vexatious thing or anything of that sort, Peggotty, I only mean that you are my true friend, and always have been, ever since the night when Mr. Copperfield first brought me home here, and you came out to the gate to meet me." Peggotty was not slow to respond and ratify the treaty of friendship by giving me one of her best hugs. I think I had some glimpses of the real character of this conversation at the time, but I am sure now that the good creature originated it and took her part in it, merely that my mother might comfort herself with the little contradictory summary in which she had indulged. The design was efficacious, for I remember that my mother seemed more at ease during the rest of the evening, and that Peggotty observed her less. When we had had our tea and the ashes were thrown up and the candles snuffed, I read Peggotty a chapter out of the Crocodile book in remembrance of old times. She took it out of her pocket. I don't know whether she had kept it there ever since. And then we talked about Salem House, which brought me round again to Steerforth, who was my great subject. We were very happy, and that evening, as the last of its race, and destined evermore to close that volume of my life, will never pass out of my memory. It was almost 10 o'clock before we heard the sound of wheels. We all got up then, and my mother said hurriedly that, as it was so late, and Mr. and Miss Murdstone approved of early hours for young people, perhaps I had better go to bed. I kissed her, and went upstairs with my candle directly, before they came in. It appeared to my childish fancy, as I ascended to the bedroom where I had been imprisoned, that they brought a cold blast of air into the house, which blew away the old, familiar feeling like a feather. Thank you for joining me. I hope you're enjoying this book as much as I am. We read every day at 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram, and all the chapters, and if you missed them, or a synopsis if you don't have time, are put up to the Fireside Reading channel on YouTube. And please check them out if you can and if you'd like. Until I see you tomorrow, same time and place, please stay very well. Good night.